Okay, hi everyone. We're going to make a start. So thanks everyone for joining. Sorry for the slight delay. It's a real pleasure to have Professor Jim Murphy from Clark University here. He's currently with us as a Holsworth visiting professor. Jim is an economic geographer. He edits the journal Economic Geography. He does work on global production networks, on socio-technical regimes and sustainability transition. He has a long-standing research agenda in sub-Saharan Africa, in Tanzania in particular, and he'll be talking to us today about Chinese neoglobalization as Webpower. So I'm just going to share the slides and then pass over to Jim. So Jim will talk for about 45 minutes, and we have plenty of time for discussion.
Thanks, Rory. Thank you, Rory. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a long ride for all of us, and this is my first real ride in terms of doing this, and I'm glad to hear this is one of your first seminars in person. It's great to be back in Manchester. I love the city, and I'm wearing my city blue for those of you who are paying attention here. So I'm going to talk today about really a project that's kind of evolved and developed, of course, in the COVID context. So there's obviously going to be limitations on what I can present here in terms of field research. It's a collaboration with colleagues in Dublin, at Trinity College, and Copenhagen. And the two of these colleagues are economists, actually, and we put together a big ERC proposal to apply this framework that I'm going to talk about today. So it's an ongoing project, but I've been able to do some field research on it in Kenya, which is really where I'm working now, more than Tanzania, actually. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to overview here. We're going to talk about this idea of neo-globalization very briefly, which is really just literally what it says. It's just contemporary forms of globalization, basically. It's not that complicated. Talk about the BRI, which is, of course, is a very hot topic, but I want to kind of get beyond that a little bit to say that this is more than just simply an infrastructure project and the like. Talk about the conceptualization we've kind of developed to look at the impact of this form of neo-globalization. About Webpower, and then talking about variegated capitalisms as it relates. And then really just illustrate this a bit through the case of East Africa, particularly through the countries of Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Just as a warning, this is mostly desk review stuff for Djibouti and Ethiopia. Kenya has more field research, which I was able to do between 2017 and 2019. But the others are really just reading through the literature and interpreting that. Assess the impacts on these economic systems, and then have some concluding remarks. So just to start, neoglobalization, a lot of this comes out of this new state capitalism research that's been going on, particularly with Adam Dixon's work and Ilyas Alami and others, and thinking about these kind of emergent modalities of geoeconomic and geopolitical integration that are playing out today. Particularly this kind of shift beyond sort of neoliberalism, maybe towards resurgent forms of state capitalism. And as Alami et al. Say, this notion of the secular shift of the world economy from the North Atlantic to the Pacific Rim, how it's imbricated in a wide set of outstanding developments. There's a changing role of state power, mutations in the construction and expressions of political authority in and through capitalist markets, and the reorganization of political and economic transnational networks of states and business elites. And this notion that there's this kind of destabilization of this kind of historic kind of north-south axis. And this is being sort of constituted through these variegations of state capital, that these heterogeneous configurations of state and non-state actors. And I'm going to get at that in a much more concrete way in a moment. And this idea of an emergent global development regime, a new sort of game in town in terms of how development is delivered, as it were, both in its big forms as well as in its more mundane, everyday kind of ways. And the BRI is really, probably one of the biggest, most remarkable projects in many ways of its kind in terms of its attempt, if you will, to really interconnect the globe into a China-centered kind of orbit, if you will. And this is a really great map of some of these different projects. Some of them are planned, some of them are done. A lot of this, of course, is focused on connectivities and flows, railways, ports, pipelines, energy grids, energy generation, the dams and things like that. And as you can see, it's this map doesn't really show its implications in the Western Hemisphere, but clearly, obviously, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and into Western Europe, it's very significant, the connectivities. But then in the South, we see this increasing engagement with Africa, and of course, with Southeast Asia is one of the biggest places where this has been playing out. In terms of trade, there's another really great map I just discovered, where you can kind of see the sort of major sort of hubs for the BRI globally, and the different types of hubs that exist, from ports to multimodal things, connecting roads and railways and things like that. And interestingly, you just see, the importance of China's trade connectivities to these places. And so you can see the dark green countries, China is the #1 trading partner for those places. Okay, so you can just see where this network, if you will, is really linking into pre-existing places, pre-existing relations that China has in terms of trade, and this is going to, arguably deepen and amplify those relationships, as well as extending China's influence and its ability to access resources and commodities from places that are proximate to its more historic trade partners. And so this is, really obviously a global project. Everybody knows about it. I'll talk about what COVID might mean for this in a minute, because obviously the world has changed since 2020. But just a few facts and figures here. It was BRI was launched in 2013. It was, it's well documented as a symbolic, ideational, as well as material and cultural phenomenon. There's loads and loads of literature on this, as I'll get to in a minute. It's the new Silk Road. It's a maritime and land-based connectivities that are meant to sort of kind of pragmatically, according to China, sort of bring peace and prosperity to all its participants through coordination, connectivity, unimpeded trade, financial integration, and people-to-people bonds. As you saw on the maps, it is really, truly a global project. And it's of course not really a singular project, as you'll see. It really is more of a kind of vision that has a lot of different diverse manifestations to it. 140 countries or so already, but just between 2013 and 2018, $614 billion in investments. And a lot of this, of course, going to energy, transportation, and then interestingly, real estate as well, which has a lot to do with like acquiring land to set up different things like SEZs and stuff like that. In terms of the distribution, over half has gone to Asia, 23% of this money into Africa, and 13% to the Middle East, and then with the remainder going to other regions. So it's a big deal, of course, in the global South in particular. Estimates of $1.2 to $1.3 trillion by 2027, but again, who really knows what that's going to look like with everything that's happened over the past 2 years. We think of it, this is really thanks to Parg, as a form of meta-regionalism that is having a profound influence on economies and development trajectories globally. And then there's this question really is this really a harbinger of a new era of globalization, or simply just another iteration of a kind of business as usual, kind of extroversion, unequal exchange kind of thing? And so that's kind of one of the driving questions for this project, essentially. Lots and lots of discussions on this. There's lots and lots of analysis and punditry, if you will, on why China is doing this. It's about global market integration and empowerment through this sort of going out strategy that started back in the noughts. A spatial fix, this is a very common way of thinking about BRI as a way to deal with overaccumulation in China. It's about when you get more of the, I would say, the boosters and these are, with Wei Dong and Nick Dunford in particular, they see this as an inclusive globalization that will do all the things that China promises it will do. It's going to be a win-win-win. Extensions of the Chinese development model through state-owned enterprises, investment-led growth, state intervention to spur the private sector. So it's kind of a policy mobilities thing for some people. A platform that operates through a blend of top-down state control and bottom-up market competition. A Sino-centric export capital regime that's state-backed as well as privatized. It's a hybrid. And then for others, it's really just kind of an idea, a discursive vision that has been laid out that doesn't really have a temporal or spatial boundary to it per se. So it's not, it can be flexibly realized, it can be pragmatically kind of addressed, as it were. And then finally, this is some recent work from James Sidaway and others, and Tim Bunnell, thinking of the BRI as a kind of an epistemological object through which we can kind of analyze and build theories about geopolitics, critical security studies, popular geopolitics, and uneven development. So lots of ways of thinking about the BRI, and there's lots of literature about why China is sort of taking on this strategy. And what we wanted to do with this project, what we're trying to do is to kind of go beyond that and sort of understand what it's actually doing on the ground, what are the concrete manifestations of this, and how can we compare across those different manifestations of this initiative. Just a quick word before I get into the framework. Yes, no doubt there's been a contraction with COVID of what China's been doing. And obviously there's not surprisingly a more inward focus dealing with the pandemic, a focus away from more high risk projects. So really going back to sort of basics and fundamentals here. And so there is a huge challenge here about the financial viability of some of these projects with all the unrest and now with the Ukraine war. But some of the punditry for foreign policy says, look, it's not died, it's still there, but it is going to shift. And the idea here is that it's going to shift away from some of this big infrastructure towards initiatives focused on things like public health, green technologies, and digital services. And IT is a big part of that, which I'll talk about. So the idea is that this neo-globalization project, as it were, is going to persist for sure. It may not be the BRI, right? It may not be the BRI. We may not be talking about the BRI except in historical terms in 5 or 10 years. Who knows? So we developed this framework to think about this, and one of the goals here again is to really develop a way to kind of not just analyze particular projects, but really to see and compare across cases how this initiative or any kind of global form of globalized state capitalism, as it were, is kind of playing out on the ground and how it's affecting the constitution of economic systems. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment. And so we argue that the BRI is really constituted or it's realized through what we call Webpower. And this idea that it's a spatially or an organizationally diffuse yet often concentrated projection, particularly into the global south. Of course, it goes well beyond the global south as well, but that's really our focus here. And there are 4 principal vectors. I'll specify these in greater detail in a minute: industrial power, financial power, what we call integrative power, which is really infrastructure, or is not just infrastructure, it's infrastructure among other things, and regulatory power. And really what we're trying to understand is what are the systemic implications for particularly Southern economies, right? So what does this really mean? Are these economies really being shaped and molded into new variegations of capitalism that are much more kind of oriented or aligned with Sino-centric ways of doing business, as it were? So we think about economic systems in a really simple way. I didn't finish the quote I was typing, but it's basically, I did finish the quote. I just didn't put a quote at the end. I put a parenthetical. A means by which societies or government organize and distribute available resources, services, and goods. Yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. And then we have these realms of governance that we're really focusing on here around production. Obviously, I don't read through all these. around labor, around finance, innovation, infrastructure, and regulatory standards. And the idea here is to really try to move beyond the varieties of capitalism approach, which I think is very Western centered and very overly determining of particular what really has to be looked at when you're comparing varieties, and also moving or adding on to the variegated capitalism's literature, which I would argue is more it doesn't really have a robust framework for it, which is one of the trade-offs. So with variegated, you get a set of variables you're supposed to look at and compare across cases. With variegated, with varieties, you get a set of variables that you're supposed to kind of look at across cases. But with the variegated approach, it's more like you're telling these kind of rich, substantive narratives about sort of conjunctures and contingent features that have shaped the evolution of political economies. And we really wanted to develop a more robust kind of way of doing more systematic, if you will, comparisons across cases. And the question again is, are we seeing in terms of these different realms sinocentric variegations emerging in the global South? And then what does this mean for the global economy in the 21st century? Are we really starting to see a substantive shift in terms of the alignment? So in thinking about the links between these vectors of Webpower and these realms, this is the way I've been kind of thinking through this. I just kind of came up with this here. We can think about industrial power, again, coming from China in particular, as manifested foreign direct investment, setting up special economic zones, imports, GPN or GVC integrations, labor migrations, knowledge transfer, tech transfer, governance variegations that this power can produce, and these are the kinds of questions we really want to ask in a sense, although I didn't put question marks. Who produces what and where, what kinds of jobs are available through FDI, labor regulations, investor obligations, industrial path creations, knowledge transfer practices, financial power, manifested fairly straightforward things you would expect. And then who determines what the finance, what does commercial finance, where does it flow, lending terms, conditionality. So one of the questions there is, are we seeing financial realms shift towards more sinocentric ways of doing commercial banking or lending and those kinds of things? Integrative power, again, infrastructure, we can talk about military support. This is really more prescient in the context of Djibouti in particular. Cultural knowledge programs, exchange, things like Confucius Institutes and those kinds of things. So some of this relate to more of the sort of people-to-people bonds part of the BRI, if you will. And then regulatory power. And here I'm really going to focus explicitly on ICT, because this is a huge deal, what's going on with the ICT standards in particular. China has taken a very active role in the International Telecommunications Union to try to restructure, reshape standards for the Internet of Things and for 5G and those kinds of things, with the obvious rationale that once you get control of the standards, you basically get the markets for your goods. You really have incredible power once you have those, the standards are more favored towards your particular phones or what have you. And so, which 5G and other internet standards predominate, and then sort of who controls mobile phone internet markets and who provides tech support. These are some of the questions. And in terms of development impacts, you can see, these different forms of these vectors of power will come in and have an impact on particular economic systems. And these could be national scale, or I would say urban regional scale as well. And they will basically articulate with these different realms in different ways to produce impacts from the upgrading, changes to export economic complexity, structural transformations, employment generation, those kinds of things. Those basically the sets of variables. And what we were doing in this proposal was, and it was a really interesting process to work through this with economists, because obviously they work in a very different way. They need data, they need to do modeling, they need to do different kinds of things. And so some of these impacts that we're trying to measure are actually sort of things that I would never have thought of, and that these are things that are very much more commonplace for economists to look at. For example, economic complexity is a really hot thing for economists to be looking at, which is essentially like things like related varieties and diversification of the economy, essentially. And so you can see these, so really, again, getting at what's the actual impacts of this, and can we trace a shift in these economic systems as a result of China's influence to certain kinds of impacts. So trying to really get that causal chain to unpacked and identified and substantiated, because I think a lot of the problem with the BRI literature is there's a lot of claims about the impact, but there isn't really a lot of direct evidence that can really prove this. And of course, as we've gotten with some of the comments on this already, this is also an enormously complex thing to isolate, right? So really trying to be reasonable about how much, what we can do in terms of factoring in other forces and influences from beyond China's realm, as it were. Okay, so I'll just pause it. What I want to do now is I want to just kind of try to illustrate some of this through the cases, the case in East Africa, particularly focusing on Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Each of these kinds of reflects a certain, I would say, variegation of the ways in which China has engaged with those places, as well as in terms of the impacts of China's engagement through the BRI and through its Webpower. So just a few facts and figures here. You know, first of all, this focus here is on Africa, and China-Africa trade is a big deal. It's bigger than the US by far. China is clearly Africa's biggest trade partner in most countries, particularly in East Africa. A couple of things to highlight. The balance of trade is hugely in China's favor. If you look at Kenya, it's a $5 billion plus in 2020 gap in terms of trade, and but we see the same with Ethiopia and Djibouti in terms of the negativity. So China principally imports from these countries raw materials, agricultural products. So for example, Ethiopia, the primary exports to China are sesame seeds and coffee, okay? And China exports to these places intermediate goods, consumer goods that have basically proliferated in most consumer marketplaces. So African consumers, particularly in these countries, are very dependent upon basic wage goods, if you will, that are produced in China. Other facts, there's a lot of scatteredness here, so I apologize. In terms of FDI in the top left there, or top right, whichever way you're looking at it, you can see that the stock is fairly robust across these countries. It's less so in Djibouti, and of course the flows are going to vary depending on the projects, right? So depending on, like, if you have an SGR project or standard gauge railway project, that's going to obviously bump up your flow for that particular year. So, but pretty steady flows most years of FDI from China. In terms of loans by government sector, you can see that the heavy dominance of transport, communications, and power. The only exception there is Ethiopia, which is an interesting case in terms of industrial investments. There's been a lot of Chinese investment, particularly in industrial zones, especially economic zones in Ethiopia. But really, a lot of this is principally about very fundamental things about flow and connectivity, right, and logistics. Chinese companies make a lot of money on these projects, despite there being attempts to mandate certain kinds of obligated forms of embeddedness, like sourcing requirements and things like that. But generally speaking, those don't really have a very significant impact, and there's ways to get around them in many cases. And in other cases, intermediate inputs that you may need for a construction project, or vehicles or things like that, may simply not be available, in some of these countries. And then you can see the workers, although the number of workers at the end of each year, Ethiopia has a considerably sizable amount. And then we don't know really what COVID's done to this, right? So obviously there's going to be COVID impacts there. So that just gives you a kind of quick snapshot of what the general numbers are there. And I think some of the questions here are really, again, there's a lot of debate and a lot of mainstream debate in these countries about China, particularly in Kenya, where the press tends to be a little more free about sort of what's China doing. Is it just a neo-colonialist? Is it all about debt trap diplomacy and these kinds of things? And then there's interesting geopolitical implications of what China's doing, particularly in Djibouti, as I'll talk about in a second. So we're really trying to get at these kind of comparisons across these cases. I'm not going to provide a lot of detail about the contexts per se in terms of the histories of each of these countries. Let's just say that they do have very different, diverse histories to them, and so I'm not going to get, and particularly I'm familiar with Kenya as well, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Djibouti and Ethiopia here, but I do want to illustrate some of the ideas of this framework and this approach through these cases. So Djibouti, one of the questions that folks are thinking about with Djibouti is this sort of a, sort of an entrepot for China in the Red Sea. Djibouti is strategically situated at the Bab el Mandeb Strait, which is what gets you from the Gulf of Aden to the Red Sea. So it's a very strategic location geopolitically, militarily. And so there's been interesting debate about Chinese investments there, and particularly the naval base, which is really one of China's first international investments in a military operation. But I'm just going to go through these different forms of power as they're playing out. Industrial power, the focus in Djibouti has been on free trade zones and the ports in particular for obvious reasons. The Suez is just up the strait, and access to the EU and later on the US markets as well. It goes through there. So there's huge investments in ports. There's been a really contentious sort of takeover of the Dorla port from the Dubai ports world, actually, which I'll get to in a minute. Here we see a policy mobility of the Sheku model being sort of exported, this idea of integrating your railways and your ports with your free trade zones in a very explicit way. And the key link here as well is, again, to Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is where a lot of this production is going on. So a lot of dependency on China for FDI in Djibouti. About 70% of its debt, 70% of its GDP is debt to China in 2022, which is really obviously a lot. We see the military base. Again, I talked about the takeover, and then what happened was Djibouti nationalizes the port and then hands over 25% of the stake to the Chinese Merchants Group as now a partner in that port. China builds a new multi-purpose port adjacent to the Dorla port. They build a standard gauge railway to Addis Ababa, water conduits, a national stadium, and China even donates a people's palace to Djibouti, which is essentially a memorial to martyrs and the independence of the country. So you can see that kind of symbolic gestures as well. In terms of IT, there's a strategic partnership with China Mobile International and Djibouti Telecom. So getting in on the ICT there. And some of the impacts, one of the questions is this China's imaginary of a Singapore in the Horn of Africa, as this entrepot, if you will. What's happened is it's actually kind of strengthened in many ways. The strongman Gula, who can deliver. He's a reliable guy to go to. He's got a lot of autocracy or authority over the country, and delivers on what China wants, basically. And here we see it's in a kind of an amalgam of state-driven, top-down geopolitical and geoeconomic arrangements. It's boosted Djibouti's GDP and generated some employment, but there's a lot of questions about debt sustainability, this dependency on China for FDI and finance, and there's been increasing inequality that's been well documented in the country. Ethiopia, different kind of case. Here you can kind of see where China is kind of seeing Ethiopia to some degree as kind of a showcase for its model of capitalism. It's been very receptive to Chinese investment and influence. I'm going to admit this person. Industrial power is huge here. This is a big deal for China. Large-scale industrial zones that enhance commodity flows to the EU and the USA. Ethiopia can produce like Kenya, for the AGOA, for the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So China investors take advantage of this. And they're able to develop really enclave zones where they produce, and they operate essentially in labor regimes and things that are very much just like China. And they're not really regulated by the state in Ethiopia. And they're also stratified, of course. We have kind of separations of Chinese and Ethiopians, as well as for skilled and unskilled labor. It's the highest ranking recipient of Chinese aid. And then again, here's all the infrastructure, the Addis Ababa light rail, the standard gauge rail over Djibouti, lots of ring roads, power lines, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam for power generation. And what's also interesting here is you have a lot of leadership institutes and training institutes and exchange programs of Ethiopians going to China to be trained in different kinds of vocations and technical skills, as well as leadership. So they're kind of modeling their leadership academies in relation to those that exist in China, some of the prominent ones in China. So the AU, the African Union headquarters, is in Addis, and China built that. And so it's had a really significant presence. And part of it is they want really other African countries, when they come to the AU meetings, to see what's going on in Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is following this kind of Chinese model pretty closely in many ways. Again, partnerships with Huawei, ZTE, and Ethio Telecom. So again, you're getting in on the and in Ethiopia's case, there's a lot of top-down control over these strategic sectors by again the rather autocratic government. So one of the questions here is this an emerging developmental state a la China? Is this going to be sort of a developmental state a la China in Africa? We see this kind of a monopolistic sort of control over strategic sectors, which is to China's favor for making investments that are safe and secure. There's been lots of employment creation, but Ethiopia has really low wages. So one of the questions about the spatial fix in Ethiopia is Ethiopia the place where China is sending all of its low wage kinds of low skilled jobs? Is it outsourcing to Ethiopia because it can no longer compete with its wages? Because I think we found out that wages are like 6 times lower than Chinese wages on average in Ethiopia. Manufacturing growth, but limited upgrading and spillovers. All these industrial zones there's a very scattergun approach. There's no real strategic planning about what businesses you set up in these. So they're limited in terms of the impacts they're able to have in terms of, economic complexity and the like. Lastly, Kenya. Here's a much different kind of dynamic, a much more diffuse kind of challenge dynamic that you don't see as much in Djibouti and Ethiopia. Industry-wise, imports are such a big deal that this is kind of really having a significant impact on, and it's a big deal everywhere, but Kenya in particular has a really strong dependence on Chinese consumer goods. Smaller firms from China operating, you have economic zones that they're being set up, but they're less grandiose and less kind of highly publicized, as it were. And so part of this has to do with Chinese. There's a lot of tension about China presence in Kenya, a lot of concerns over what's going on, a lot of, I would suggest racism in some ways against Chinese people. And that kind of thing. And so China tends to take a more lower profile than many of what it does in Kenya. But you have a lot more of these small and medium enterprises essentially that are kind of dispersed. And then you have a lot of enterprises that are just importers. So they're set up essentially like that firm in the top that's a lighting company. So they're set up to import goods from factories in China for particularly construction, because there's so much rampant real estate speculation in cities like Nairobi. There's a high demand for construction materials. So a lot of mature industries in those kinds of things. Speculative real estate investment in Nairobi is just staggering right now in terms of this, like a lot of African cities, and there's some good literature about what's going on around this. And then the standard gauge railway, of course, which is by many accounts being realized to be a fairly significant kind of boondoggle in terms of the money that was spent and the debt that was created vis-a-vis the impacts that it's had on transportation and logistics in Kenya. Again, ports, transport, ICT infrastructure. So they're building a lot of data centers. Again, they're trying to promote the special economic zone model, but not to the degree that you see in Djibouti. And it's it's essentially a much, again, another kind of scattergun approach here. Data centers, technical training centers, and then China Telecom Global established itself at one of these data centers. So the impacts, there's been an attempt to get more out of China by mandating local content sourcing, but here you have the Webpower kind of articulating with these kinds of oligarchic, or I should say kind of rent-seeking, or I should say politically connected networks of folks who are basically taking advantage of the ability to get these contracts, and usually for really low value things like sand or rock or fill or things like that for construction projects. It's not really generating the kinds of upgrading opportunities for industries. These SEZs, there was an export processing zone policy in Kenya, but then they replaced it because they wanted to follow the Chinese model with an SEZ policy, but they didn't get rid of the export processing zone policy. So what firms do is they'll sign up to get the tax breaks for the EPZ, and then they'll switch over to the SEZ. So they're basically not paying any significant taxes. They're able to just shut down and sort of reopen as a different business, as it were, in the other center. Mega projects are preferred by the Kenyan state in particular because it creates opportunities for rent seeking, particularly around land speculation. So the whole SGR thing, when politicians knew what the route was going to be, they basically bought up through their networks. They bought up the land along the railway, and then were able to negotiate with the state, and so it ended up costing. As it says, I think it costs like 2.5 billion. It cost 2.5 billion, which is a lot more than it was supposed to cost. Some work I've been doing in Nairobi this is part of this kind of dynamic towards splintered urbanization, which we'll talk about in my next talk in a week or so. Lots of debt default concerns, but here it's interesting with labor because there's been a lot of pushback in Chinese factories and firms. So Kenyan workers have been striking and challenging this, and so there's a precarity to China's presence in Kenya to some degree. They're very cognizant of the fact that they're already kind of on shaky ground in terms of public sentiment. So they need to be cautious with labor, and this creates more complications for firms. So you can imagine there's less of an interest vis-a-vis places like Ethiopia in setting up large-scale manufacturing at a wide scale, if you will. And then lastly, these imports are kind of crowding out domestic manufacturers. Okay, a couple more slides. So summing it up, getting back to the kind of idea of these realms, I kind of was thinking through this the past week and thinking about, well, what can we really see going on in terms of the shifts in these different realms? Are we seeing them shifting towards more Sinocentric, if you will, ways of doing things? Certainly production realms, definitely China is having a very significant influence in these places. These are increasingly governed by Chinese investors, enterprises, imports, workers in many cases, particularly around more skilled work and management. So you do see a significant shift towards China here that's actually playing out on the ground, which is not really a surprise. In terms of labor, it's interesting. So one of the reasons why Ethiopia is so attractive is because these Chinese firms can kind of set up these kind of almost like I forget who's called it this, these like sovereignty regimes, where it's basically these industrial zones. All the firms are Chinese. They all speak Chinese to each other. They manage these places just like it's China. It's just like you've gone to China when you go into these zones. And the workers there have to operate under rules and norms of management and laboring that exist in China. This can be obviously challenging for Ethiopians in that case, but there's also precarity for Chinese lower skilled workers who come and migrate to these places as well. It's not just about China versus Africans. It's contested and complicated outside of that. So I would say China is not really having a really significant impact on national labor realms per se in countries, just only in those tight places where it can control, partly because it's dealing with people and different kinds of histories there. There's a dependence on China for FDI and a shift in alignment, particularly for productive investments, clearly. But what I think is interesting here, it's less, you see less of an impact on domestic finance, how that works. And so it kind of operates again in a kind of separate way to what these particular forms of concessional loans or Exim Bank deals and those kinds of things for these bigger projects, as well as for smaller firms and conglomerates and merchants groups, whatever, setting up industrial zones. But what is common across both of those realms is the speculation, so the speculative real estate stuff that's going on. That is really, so I was reading that, in a city of Nairobi, 6% of land is taken up by 60% of the population. And the rest is big. And there's really no open space in Nairobi anymore. I mean, you have the parks that have managed to survive, a couple of them, the Arboretum, but basically it's every piece of land has been bought up and it's all about luxury housing, essentially. And so people sock their money into that. And a lot of this is also coming from Chinese investments. In terms of innovation, Ethiopia is perhaps the most significant, but we still aren't seeing the kinds of spillovers and indigenous kind of domestic upgrading, partly because of the enclave nature of the way production is going on in Ethiopia. Infrastructure, obviously, highly significant impacts. The road systems, China's become the go-to provider. So, but what I think is important here is how infrastructure realms, and this again is something I'll talk about the next talk. There's been a hollowing out. So where you're getting the money coming in for infrastructure is all about ring roads, connectivity, airport upgrades, ports, systems that are going to facilitate external integration and are going to facilitate what I would suggest is the exchange value of places in global markets, perhaps, right? Be they for cheap labor or what have you. What China isn't really facilitating, and there's no money in most of these countries to do so, is the use value of cities. So you still have Nairobi, the internal infrastructure for people who actually live there and the quality of life. We have 60% of people living in slums, totally inadequate sanitation. There's no investments going on in that. I mean, there are, but they're not coming in big ways through Chinese interests, which is not really that surprising. And then finally, this is going to be a big deal, I think, playing forward is what's going to happen around ICTs and standards and things, and how China's really positioned itself in a very significant way. I mean, it's less so in Kenya, in part because Safaricom has been such a successful entity with its partnership with Vodafone and with its M-Pesa app and things like that. So it's less so in Kenya, but it's more behind the scenes. It's more like the data centers and controlling the kind of connectivities through the internet. There's also a new cable that's being built or invested in by China around Africa, although I don't know where the status of that project is. Okay, just to close up. So I think what's important here is that, obviously we have to get well beyond the kind of stereotypes about what China's doing and the oversimplifications like the cartoon. And I think what we see is these diverse couplings that are playing out through these different vectors. We see definitely a reshaping and redirecting of various realms in East Africa's economic systems, as I just talked about. Definitely mixed development outcomes, and so not really game-changing in terms of widespread improvements in distribution and quality of life, but definitely some growth enhancement, some employment generation, I would say, particularly in Ethiopia, where there's been some significant job creation through some of these investments. It's an evolving geoeconomic and geopolitical process of coupling. And I think that's important because what I think you're going to see is because it's very adaptive and flexible and multifaceted, it's pragmatic, it's going to be very, it's not going to be, particularly now with COVID over or almost over, hopefully, it's going to be much more about ensuring that there's kind of guarantees. And this is where I think Kenya might actually drop off in terms of its significant interest, because it may be too much of too difficult to really do the kind of business that China wants to do in Kenya, vis-a-vis places like Ethiopia and Djibouti. And Djibouti, again, just being really a kind of a gateway to the EU and the US markets for goods, as well as for resources from Sudan and things like that. And then the question is, is this really an alternative to Western modalities? And I think it is different for sure. I don't know what it's really going to mean in terms of, and if I did, I'd be crazy to say I did. That what is it really going to transform the world system? I don't know. I think it's an interesting question to think about, and we're trying to figure out how to actually get at this, analyzing whether or not it is really scaling up to a kind of new kind of global south, if you will, that's where you're going to have the majority of the world's population now more operating in economic systems that are more aligned with China. And I think that's an interesting question. Don't have an answer. But there is a need for critical, comparative, and global analysis of these articulations and impacts. So thank you. I'll stop there.